All right, official welcome to everyone. This is our October session of the monthly 2025 webinar series. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Also with us tonight from MRBO is Ethan Duke. The mission of our organization is the conservation of birds and all wildlife through science, education, and advocacy. Happy to see a lot of folks that have been on here before, some of whom I know about our organization, but everyone can find out more at mrbo.org. I just wanted to remind everyone about our last couple of webinars of the year, as well as a few upcoming events. Next month, we will host Tara Homan of the Upper Mississippi River Division of the National Audubon Society. She'll be telling us all about National Audubon's work here in Missouri. And then in December, we have Bill White, who's an incredibly knowledgeable ecologist, land steward, and private lands biologist who is now grasslands coordinator at the Conservation Federation of Missouri. He'll be talking to us about Farm Bill conservation programs. And that might sound a little bit wonky, but please note that more than 25 million acres of our precious prairies and wetlands are conserved by various Farm Bill programs. And Bill's going to be giving all of us a layperson's rundown of how that all works. Um, this Friday, October 24th, we are having, hopefully, if it doesn't rain on our parade, having a cookout and stargazing party in Arrow Rock with our friend Vayu of Dark Sky, Missouri. On Saturday, MRBO will be working with Missouri Conservation Corps on invasive privet removal, also in Arrow Rock. And in a totally separate event, we're working with Missouri River Relief to do a plastic brand audit at the Bonnet Mill River access outside of Jeff City. And then on November 1st, we have our fourth community advocacy workshop on plastic of the year at Earth's Classroom in Rosebud, Missouri. And there's more, but I'm going to put the links to more information and registration from everything I just said into the chat. So thanks everyone for bearing with me on all of those things in my non-slide. So our webinar topic of the evening, this topic, cats and their effects on our native wildlife. This has been specifically requested by a number of these webinar audience members over the last couple of years. And Ethan and I were really excited to meet our speaker of this evening and her colleague, Heather Barron, who presented for us in August. Some of you might remember. We all met at the American Bird Conservancy fly-in to Washington, D.C. in April, where we were all there to advocate for birds on a variety of topics. Dr. Riley has a bachelor's degree in animal science from Cornell University and a DVM from Tufts University. She completed internships at the Belize Wildlife Clinic and the Clinic for the Rehabilitation of Wildlife in Florida, as well as a fellowship in zoological medicine at Lion Country Safari, also in Florida. Dr. Riley is the hospital director at Blue Ridge Wildlife Center in Virginia, a position that she's held since 2016. So, Jen, we're super excited to have you tonight, and you can take it away.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you guys for having me. Get started right here. All right, so today I'm talking about cats and wildlife. Make sure this is, there we go. Just to give you a little bit of background real quick on Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, as mentioned, we are a full-service wildlife teaching hospital. We're located in Boyce, Virginia. So this is a veterinary and rehabilitation facility. We care for about 4,000 animals per year. We're also heavily involved in research, education, and professional training. So we are a teaching hospital that has vet students and tech students and wildlife rehabilitation students. So we have a lot of people coming through our doors all the time, in addition to a whole lot of animals. The objectives of this talk are really to understand the variety of ways in which cats impact wildlife. I think we all hear a lot about direct predation, but that's definitely not the only way they're impacting wildlife. I also want to make sure we understand the welfare issues for cats that are being left outdoors and why TNR programs are not an effective single solution. I want to look at current legal challenges, and this will largely focus on Virginia because that's where I am, but a lot of this is state to state, and a lot of it is similar across states. I also want to learn, make sure that you guys learn about different tools that could be considered to manage free-roaming cat populations. And then I just wanted to give a warning that there will occasionally be graphic images from a wildlife hospital. So if you are very opposed to that, you might need to look away at times. So as a basic review of Felis catus, this is the species that I'm talking about, and these are domestic cats. So I hear a lot of people talking about feral cats and stray cats and wild cats as if it's a separate thing. These are all the species Felis catus, and that is a genetic distinction. So within Felis catus, within the domestic cat species, we have free-ranging cats, and that is any domestic cat that roams outdoors without restriction. And then within free-ranging cats, we talk about stray cats and feral cats. So strays are free-ranging cats that are habituated to people, and ferals are free-ranging cats that are not habituated. So those are all the only real terms that I consider. You also hear things like community cats. A lot of these things are just kind of PR moves. They're not really describing one of these discrete categories. Looking at the background, there are no native domestic cats anywhere in the world, right? They are a domesticated species most closely related to the Near Eastern wildcat. They share a common ancestor, but they are not a species that is native anywhere. And they are actually invasive everywhere that they do exist. I'm sure this audience knows that invasives are non-native to the ecosystem, and they are species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So again, domestic cats are not native anywhere on Earth, and they are known to cause harm to the economy, the environment, and human health everywhere they do exist. So when we're looking at how big of a threat they are to wildlife specifically, there are only a handful of studies, the biggest ones being in the United States and in Australia. And in the US, we talk a lot about birds. I think birds have the best marketing team here. About 2.4 billion birds per year are killed by direct predation from cats. Mammals are actually quite a bit higher than that, and I'm not sure everybody always realizes that, but estimates range between 6 and 20 billion wild mammals killed in the US every year. And reptiles and amphibians tend to be in the counts of hundreds of millions. So I think these are really important numbers to consider. This is the biggest anthropomorphic cause of wildlife death aside from habitat destruction, but it's also important to recognize that maps like this are only accounting for direct predation, so animals that are directly being killed by cats. This is often the easiest factor to measure, which is why we do it, and it's still not easy to measure. So it's still that's why we have these huge ranges for cat-attacked animals. And focusing on just one cause of population decline dramatically underestimates the damage being done. So that's my only problem with it. The 2.4 billion for birds is a massive number, but it's also a massive underestimate. And I think it's important to mention, of course, that all of the problems listed that we're talking about here, if you look at everything on kind of that little bar chart there, yes, the cats are the one on the left. They are by far the largest one. Coming in at a second is the building and window collisions, then automobile collisions, and then you have things like wind turbines all the way at the end. So all of these things certainly do kill birds, and they're all important, but they are all human-caused problems. Nobody is blaming cats, just like nobody is calling, windows and cars evil. So these are all human factors that we have an impact on. So at Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, this picture here is just a 1-month survey. This was June, I think, of 2023, that we had all of our deceased cat attack patients. These are cat attack patients that did not survive just from that month alone. And at our wildlife hospital, similar to other wildlife hospitals, about 12% of our annual patient load is made up of confirmed cat attack cases. We also have a lot of unconfirmed cat attack cases. So this is situations where cats were found nearby and the animal has, certain sized puncture wounds and very specific signs that we very frequently see with cat attacks. If we include those numbers, it becomes almost a quarter of our patients that are cat attack victims. So for our numbers, this is, hundreds and hundreds of animals per year. And unfortunately, cat attacks do have the highest mortality rate of any cause of admission at our hospital, with the single exception of gunshot. So our hit by car animals are much more likely to survive than our cat attacked animals. So some graphic photos here, sorry about that. But the damage, I think it's important to note, is not always visible until necropsy. A lot of the animals that we see come in with cat attack wounds or suspected cat attack wounds don't actually have wounds. Cats in general have really small, sharp teeth, and they're very good at seeding bacteria. So the teeth go into the animal, the bacteria in their mouths, which is often Pasteurella multocida. It's a really common bacteria that is very dangerous and causes really severe infections. This gets seeded by the teeth and sometimes by the claws. And as they pull out, the skin actually closes over that. So by the time the animal comes into care, we don't have any kind of wound. We just have infection brewing. This is a bigger issue sometimes with birds because it'll go straight into the air sacs. And that's what's happening with this fledgling robin in the picture here. In this case, same thing, the sharp teeth are going in, they're puncturing the air sacs. And as they pull out, the skin closes on top of it. So that air that was in the air sacs is now loose under the subcutaneous tissue. And so these birds come in looking like little bubbles, And of course, that's pushing on their air sacs and causing difficulty breathing for them. But it also seeds bacteria to their entire respiratory system, which is throughout their body in birds. So all patients with a history of cat attack are started on pain meds and antibiotics immediately upon admission. So regardless of the wounds that we actually see, we know that they are very, very likely there, and that if we don't address them quickly, that infection within 12 to 24 hours can become a fatal situation. And then even with treatment, we know that about 70% of cat attack patients are still going to die in care. So high mortality rate. Last really graphic picture here, but I put this up because a lot of people will call our wildlife center and say, my cat got a bunny, it got a bird, it got whatever, but I don't see any damage, so I'm gonna release it. And it's sometimes a really hard fight to get these people to actually bring animals in for care. And a lot of that is because they don't see the damage because of those fine little teeth and because they're not leaving these large puncture wounds like dogs or other predators might. They see something similar to the bunny on the right, which came in alive and upright. It is euthanized in this photo. But again, you just see a little bit of rough fur. They're not seeing anything too bad. And a lot of the cat owners that find these guys will tell us, it looks like there's some saliva on the fur. I don't see any actual wounds. I don't think he's badly injured. So we always do a necropsy in these situations just so we can give them the full rundown of the wounds that we saw. So in this case, it wasn't just saliva on the fur. We saw punctures into the thorax. We saw severe bruising and hematomas around the thorax. We saw punctures into the skull and skull fractures and bleeding around the skull and the brain. So very, very severe injuries that frequently don't look so severe from the outside. So that's kind of direct losses. And this is something that we see mostly direct losses, obviously, in a wildlife center setting. But I like to focus on the indirect losses as well, because like I said, I think they are just as important, if not more important, and I think they are often greatly overlooked. So fear-related effects, I think, are a really important one that's overlooked a lot. And this is more of a population level thing. And unfortunately, there's not too many studies because it is so hard to study. But there are two studies using squirrels and blackbirds as the primary species involved and looking at the presence of cats in their environment. And just the presence of cats has been found to decrease the breeding success of these species by up to 40%, which is pretty massive. That's a population level change. And they're doing this by having increased alarm calls and increased intraspecies aggression that actually attracts third-party predators. So even if it's not the cat coming to kill them, the stress of having the cat in the environment is causing these animals to have more arguments amongst themselves, to make more of a scene, to not hide as well as they might usually be hiding, things like that that are actually going to attract other predators. It also has shown significant decreases in the amount of food that can make it back to the nest for feeding young. So if birds are worried about defending their territory and they're worried about cats in their neighborhood, they are not going to be as successful as bringing food back as they would normally be, and therefore their young are not going to be as successful and not as likely to fledge, not as likely to actually grow up and reproduce themselves. We also see decreased foraging when cats are in the area. So having a predator nearby will make that animal less willing to go out and forage for food, less likely to defend their nest. And we also know that it's associated with a decrease in body condition and increased susceptibility to other causes of mortality. And then just from a normal medical standpoint, we know it's extremely stressful and stress causes immunocompromisation. So these animals are more likely to get other diseases just because they are stressed from having this excessive, non-native predator in their environment. Aside from the fear-related effects, we have disease-related effects, and this is massive. And I think a lot of people already know about this, but I think that it's often not considered enough when we're talking about outdoor cats. So death or increased mortality of wildlife due to disease specifically. And the big diseases that we talk about are toxoplasmosis and rabies, but plague, feline leukemia, and FIV, when you talk about the native wild cats like Florida panthers and bobcats, are an issue. And then endoparasites that can go between species are also a really big issue in wildlife. So toxoplasmosis is by far kind of the biggest one that we see problems with in wildlife, in humans, really across the board. And the picture that you see here is from California sea otters. And one study showed that 16% of these sea otters were directly killed by toxoplasmosis. So they were dying from toxoplasmosis. And others that were severely infected, that had signs of sickness and disease, were more likely to be predated upon. So suggesting not only that, direct kill from the disease, but also an additional indirect mortality that's caused by that disease. One thing that we see a lot in wildlife centers is indirect losses from cat-caused congregation. So we know that a lot of outdoor cats are fed at feeding stations. If they are feral cats, they may be part of a colony, and these feeding stations can be hugely problematic. There's also just the everyday person who leaves food outdoor for their pets. If they are letting their cat free roam, it is likely they are also leaving food out for their pet. And this causes a lot of problems for wildlife. We see a lot of malnutrition or obesity. So animals that should not be eating dog and cat food that are eating it way too frequently because they are having access to this food at these stations. And this is typically the animals that you would think of as kind of nuisance animals in your neighborhood. So opossums, raccoons, foxes, those are by far the most common animals that we see with malnutrition or obesity issues due to cat feeding stations. We also see increases in diseases like distemper and rabies and mange. And these are diseases that are not necessarily specific to cats or even tied to cats. So cats don't get distemper. They don't get this type of distemper that our raccoons and foxes are getting. But having the other wildlife species congregate at these feline feeding stations increases their risk of spreading these things. So we end up seeing, large outbreaks of distemper, especially in our raccoon and skunk populations, associated closely with feeding stations. And in birds, we talk a lot about feeder diseases, and I kind of like to remind people that this is the same situation. So if you're talking about birds, you might think of trichomoniasis or mycoplasmosis or salmonellosis, things that you can often contract by being at a feeder that is not clean. And that's what's really happening with these cat feeding stations is that they're not properly cleaned, and they're really just a great way to spread disease and to congregate lots of animals. This is information specific to Virginia, but you can always look this up for your state. The most frequently testing positive for rabies. So this is impacted somewhat by submissions, right? So domestic cats are very commonly submitted for testing, and they are the fourth most common species to test positive for rabies in the state of Virginia. The first three being raccoon, skunk, and fox, and then bats after domestic cats, which I think surprises a lot of people. A lot of people know about bats and rabies, and certainly most cases of human-caused rabies have been from bats in the US, but most exposures overwhelmingly are from domestic cats. So in the US, 90% of our rabies cases are in wild species, and we know that. We know that this is an endemic disease, that we have lots of wildlife that has rabies and that can potentially spread it. But 30 to 50%, depending on the state that you live in, of the post-exposure prophylaxis that it's administered is given after cat bites specifically. So cats are causing a much higher rate of exposure. And I think a lot of that is because you're not going to be approaching, hopefully, in most cases, raccoons, skunks, and foxes, trying to pet them, that kind of thing. And unlike the bats, which sometimes people can be asleep or they might not know that they were bit, you're going to know if you were attacked by a raccoon. Domestic cats are kind of this special one where people are outside wandering around, they see what looks like a friendly cat, they're going to approach it and pet it in a way that they wouldn't do for a skunk or raccoon or fox, and that leads to this massive amount of exposure. And then testing, which is always done due to exposures, right? So you only test an animal for rabies, not if you think it's rabid. We see lots of rabid animals or animals that we believe are rabid at our center every single day, but we're not testing those animals. We're only testing the animals that have had human or domestic animal exposures. And that happens a lot more frequently with cats. So in the US, this was 2019 data. It takes a couple years to kind of get the freshest data. They had over 21,000 cats tested. So this is a huge economic cost. It costs the state that tests our patients for rabies when indicated about $200 per case just to test. So this is a huge burden. And then of course, if the person needs post-exposure prophylaxis, that is tens of thousands of dollars. So this is a major healthcare burden as well. Looking at domestic animals, cats are still by far the most common to be positive. So below that, you actually see the red line here is cats. So much, much higher than the other domestic lines, followed by cattle. And then you have dogs below that. We do have occasional livestock issues with rabies, and I think people also don't appreciate that too. The larger the animal is, the more likely it is to survive an attack by a rabid animal, right? So things like squirrels and mice can certainly get rabies. They do get rabies. We've had positive squirrels in Virginia. We've had, multiple positive small species. But in general, when those animals get attacked by a rabid animal, they're very likely going to die. Whereas a cow or a horse or something like that getting attacked is much more likely to survive an attack. So that's why you see some of the larger animals. And same thing for wildlife. We do occasionally get deer. Same reason, they are big enough to kind of survive those attacks. But when you're talking about carnivores, cats on the domestic side are far and away the most common positive. So rabies, 100% fatal in people, definitely something to be concerned about. Toxoplasmosis, I would argue, is the bigger issue. So for toxoplasmosis, cats are the only definitive host. That means they are required for the life cycle to continue. If you take cats out of the environment, the cysts that cause toxoplasmosis are no longer in existence, right? You need the cat to have that. So humans and wildlife can all be infected by toxoplasmosis by ingesting the oocysts, typically in contaminated food or water. And this also makes it misleading to a lot of people because toxo is often talked about as a foodborne disease, and that's because people are getting it from consuming contaminated food. But again, contamination of that food is only happening due to feline feces. So you have to have a cat pooping in your garden or, getting it into the water supply in your area for you to be exposed that way. You can also be exposed by eating undercooked meat if the animal has these cysts in their meat. You can also get it by blood transfusions, and you can also get it transplacentally. So this is why people talk a lot about not having pregnant women clean litter boxes. The concern is literally pregnant women eating cat poop, right? They're not eating handfuls of it here. It's not what we're talking about, but by getting contaminated and having these oocysts on their hands and then eating or drinking something, getting it in their mouth, ingesting it, they can then get toxoplasmosis. And it can be extremely dangerous for the growing fetus. I don't think people realize how common toxo is in humans because it is not highly fatal, especially not right away. So US, they have studies that show between 12 and 22% of adults do have toxoplasmosis. They have been exposed to toxoplasmosis. If you look at countries that have more free-roaming cats, those numbers go up a lot. So Greece is one of the countries that has a lot of free-roaming cats, and almost 45% of their population is estimated to have toxoplasmosis. So generally not considered a huge issue because it is generally asymptomatic. In 10 to 20% of cases, you're going to develop very self-limiting flu-like symptoms, and you'll never think about it again. The problem comes when you're much older or immunocompromised for any reason. So people with autoimmune disorders, this happened a lot with people with AIDS that would suddenly become immunocompromised, or people who are getting chemotherapy for cancer treatments or organ transplants, things like that. If you become immunocompromised, that can reactivate these latent infections, and you have much higher death rates due to toxo when your immune system can't fight it. We also see a lot of birth defects and miscarriage with toxoplasmosis. Again, that's why they want to have pregnant women avoid litter boxes. It is specifically at a specific time in pregnancy when ingesting those oocysts and getting infected could cause a problem. And then more recently, in the last 10 years or so, there's been some really interesting studies talking about the long-term effects of asymptomatic toxoplasmosis in humans, and is it really asymptomatic? There's a lot of signs of memory loss and different kind of neurological issues, delayed mental development. Schizophrenia has been related to it. So there's a lot of things that, right now these are correlation, not causation kind of things. There needs to be a lot more research done, but there's some really interesting studies on these long-term effects as well. In wildlife, I use this data from Fairfax County in Virginia. So this is a county near our center, but between 81 and 88% of the raccoons sampled had toxoplasmosis. And it's really high in a lot of our wildlife species. So we're not saying that 88% of our raccoons are dying from toxoplasmosis. These are just animals who are impacted by it. So much like humans, most cases are going to be subclinical. They're not going to be having overt signs. But again, when they get immunocompromised or they have something else going on, this is a disease that could really take over and actually cause their death. So at Blue Ridge, one of our research projects, we do a lot of research. We're involved in about a dozen studies right now, and one is looking specifically at the prevalence of toxoplasmosis in all of our wild species. So we know that it causes a lot of neurologic disease in our species. It causes a variety of different clinical signs, emaciation, chronic problems. So we are testing pretty much everybody that comes in that we get a blood sample on for any other reason to see their exposure levels to toxo. And we've had some really interesting ones come up, a lot more bald eagles than we thought we would see, a lot of American robins. Just kind of some unique trends in some of the species that we've seen, and that hopefully we'll finish up with the study in the next year or so and get some of that data out to you guys too. And they think that a lot of zoo and wildlife species are showing higher mortality rates than humans, possibly due to the fact that we're not finding as many of these infections. We're lucky to be part of this study, but it is actually really expensive to test for toxoplasmosis. So wildlife centers, which are nonprofits, there's no state or federal funding for wildlife centers anywhere in the US. We have to come up with that money ourselves, or we have to get grants specifically for this. So it's not something that most centers are going to routinely test for. Wildlife also have a lot of increased likelihoods of immunocompromising conditions. They're immunocompromised for a wide variety of reasons, things like rodenticides or heavy metal toxicities, things that we see very, very commonly at our facility and that other wildlife centers see that really do increase your risk for things like toxo becoming much more problematic. And it might also be increased exposure. So, right, unlike humans, they're not washing their produce before they eat it. These guys are eating off the ground. They're sharing environments with cats. They are exposed a lot more frequently than we are. And in wildlife, just like it can in people, it typically kills immunocompromised individuals, can cause miscarriage, and possibly have population effects on the animals that are more frequently being exposed or having higher rates. The Hawaiian monk seal I just put down there is one of the examples of a species that's been severely in decline because of toxoplasmosis. Talking a little bit about some of the birth defects that you might see with toxo, hydrocephalus is one of the really common ones that we see in wildlife. And there are a couple causes for hydrocephalus, but toxo is certainly one of them. And this is basically a disease where your brain cannot drain fluid and it builds up within the brain. So it fills the lateral ventricles of the brain and it actually pushes the brain against the skull. The skull is not very forgiving, right? It's not going to stretch with your head. So you end up squishing brain tissue. And when you squish brain tissue, you lose vision, you lose cerebral function. So in many cases, we see this in animals that have high rates of toxo. So raccoons, foxes, things like that. Almost 6% of our foxes, our fox kits that come in with severe congenital defects like this. And many of them are toxo related. So in these cases, they're coming in about the age of this little guy. This is when the rest of the kits in the group are weaning, and these guys are able to nurse just like other babies can. But when the other ones start getting a little bit older, they start trying to walk around a little bit and they're starting to leave the den or explore just outside the den. These guys can't do that. These hydrocephalus kits are blind. They can't walk properly. They kind of army crawl. It's a very kind of classic look with this apple-shaped head. And there's a normal radiograph of a normal similarly aged fox kit below this one. So you can see the one on the top is much more of a chihuahua looking head. They have kind of shorter looking muzzles and really round skulls. And that is very typical of hydrocephalus. We cannot treat these guys. By the time they come in, it is much too far gone. So these are pretty much all euthanasia cases by the time they would come into a wildlife center. Switching gears a little bit to the cats themselves. So the big question becomes, is it humane for cats themselves to be outdoors? And as a veterinarian and as an animal advocate, I would argue no. We know that they're exposed to vehicle collisions, poisonings, wild predators, loose domestic pets like dogs, cruel humans. We know people that illegally shoot cats or want them dead. Disease, dangerous weather, and we know their life expectancy drops to less than 5 years. So significant decrease in life expectancy. This is just not a humane way to treat domestic animals. Some basic thoughts I want to remind you of. So cats make great pets. I love cats. Many of my friends and family have cats, but they cause immense harm and are exposed to immense harm themselves when we allow them to free roam. And I think nearly everyone agrees that free roaming cats need to be managed. Whether you're a TNR advocate or opponent, that's one thing that I think everybody that is part of this argument really does agree on, that we want to see these numbers reduced. And reduction, not just maintenance, needs to be the goal of that. I mentioned TNR, which is trap, neuter, release. And that is a very often cited strategy for managing outdoor cats. So from my personal perspective, I think trapping them and neutering them is absolutely wonderful. I do think that's kind of the first step if we want to get these guys adopted out and into proper homes. The failure here comes at the release portion. So I would argue this is abandonment at that point, and that non-kill or no-kill does not equal humane. I think that's kind of the biggest argument for it, is people want cats treated humanely, as do I. And they think that a no-kill method, a method that does not require euthanasia, is going to be a humane option. And given all those threats that we just talked about with cats, it's not a humane option for them. And TNR has not been considered for other invasive species. If you look at the Norway rat, house sparrows, starlings, Burmese pythons in the Everglades, things like that, it has not been considered. It's not a viable option because of the cost and the lack of efficacy. So these are domestic animals, cats, and returning them to the wild is unacceptable and it's inhumane. So I don't think even if TNR did work, we couldn't treat them the same way. TNR, if it worked, would be a great option for Burmese pythons, but not for domestic animals. There is a small but vocal group of animal care professionals, and that includes people like veterinarians and many shelter workers and things like that, that do believe TNR is humane, and they don't see all of those negative effects happening to cats as a problem. And unfortunately, I think the public largely supports the idea of TNR and largely believes that it's effective, right? I think if you think about it as a very basic, sterilizing a cat leads to that cat not having babies. If you're just looking at that simple equation, then yes, it could make sense that this might be an effective method of population control, but we know that's not the case. But because it is so easy, it's something that you can look at a diagram and say, sure, TNR works. I think that it is largely supported by the public. And then there are stakeholders that are against TNR, and this largely includes veterinarians and animal rights and welfare advocates, public health professionals, wildlife professionals, wildlife biologists and ecologists, property owners who don't want to see their gardens and stuff destroyed, animal shelters and animal control officers. So there's a whole lot of people who are stakeholders that are not proponents of TNR. And one thing even though I'm talking about it a lot right here, that I want to remind you of is that there's not this debate of TNR versus no TNR. It's not something that really exists, right? That tends to be the fight that everybody ends up at. But these are not the only two options when it comes to managing outdoor cats, and they won't be effective options. So when we talk about managing cat populations, just like any other population, there's this one basic equation that you need to look at, and that's the births plus the immigration. So animals coming into the community, either by wandering in or by being born into it, minus the deaths or individuals that are leaving the community. That's what causes the change in the population. So death and immigration are always going to happen eventually. We need to stop the births and we need to stop the immigration. So sterilization methods, including TNR, and this is something that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that it really requires 70% of the animals in that population be sterilized with no immigration, zero immigration, and a normal death rate. That's the only way that the population will even start to decrease. And not necessarily decrease quickly, right? It might still take decades, but you need that at least 70% number, ideally higher than 90%, to actually have a decrease in the population. So that is not what's happening with current TNR as it is practiced. So right now, what's going on in the world, in the communities, is not effectively reducing the populations. We're not hitting those adequate sterilization rates. And then in rare situations, there are occasional studies that you'll read where TNR was performed and the population did decrease, but there have been a lot of other factors at play. So the University of Florida study is one of the common ones that people reference, but this study was very strict on preventing immigration. They did not allow any new cats into the colony, and they euthanized sickly animals really promptly, and they adopted out many healthy strays that were well habituated to people. So that's not a normal situation. I've personally been involved in situations where TNR was done in an island setting where there was a known number of animals, 7 cats. We spay and neuter all those cats. That population did decrease over time until people brought new cats in. So they can be successful in these small kind of scale, really well-controlled situations. But again, you're still leaving these cats outside, exposed to all of these conditions that are not humane. So I don't believe it's something that's humane or appropriate for domestic animals. Feeding cats, which happens with or without TNR, so a lot of people will feed strays without any intention of spaying or neutering them, definitely increases the cat's chance of survival, but it decreases the wildlife's chance of survival, and it decreases disease spread. So feeding cats does not prevent them from killing other wildlife. It's something that actually makes them stronger and even better at it, and it decreases the wildlife's chance to compete. And of course, like I talked about with the congregation and feeding stations, it's a massive problem for disease spread. One of the main issues around TNR is this lack of legislation. So not everybody practicing TNR is doing it to the same standard. They're not always doing it ethically, and very few are doing it effectively. Many cases, they are just feeding intact strays, or they're just getting such small numbers or percentages of the community actually spayed or neutered, and it's not really having the impact that they desire. One of my biggest concerns about TNR is that it does create a culture where the public believes it's okay to have cats outside. You know, they have this theory that my cat will be taken care of if I put it in a colony. It's better than going to the shelter where it might end up euthanized. And that's something that I think we need to get away from. Obviously, these cats that are dumped in colonies are certainly not better off than being euthanized humanely at a shelter. The fact that it is not safe for wildlife or human health to TNR, right? So TNR, if you did it to the highest possible standard, would decline the birth rate, but we still have animals that are out there killing wildlife, spreading disease, and harming human health. TNR is not technically legal in many states, so including Virginia, they do consider TNR abandonment. So this is something that could be prosecuted. And in many cases, often because of the increased feeding and the below needed sterilization rates, we actually see populations increase in these areas. So I mentioned a couple of these reasons why it is challenging and does not work effectively. One of the other concerns is that few of these animals are ever retrapped for revaccination. And we certainly have had animals that we know had a one-off vaccine still develop rabies later because they were not kept up to date. These animals are, again, still domestic. They still deserve regular health checks and professional care. And retrapping them can be extremely traumatizing if it's even possible, which it's not in many cases. There's also no standard requirement for vaccination, deworming, microchipping, or ear tipping. You'll see a lot of cases where people say, you know, all spayed and neutered cats are ear tipped, and that's how you know. It's one way that some organizations use to identify animals in a colony that have been spayed or neutered, but it is certainly not universal. And microchipping would be a much better option for free-roaming cats if it were required. And vaccinations and deworming, again, we just can't keep those things up to date when you're not able to regularly contain these animals and recheck them. One of my concerns about a lot of the large organizations that promote TNR is that they do trap, neuter, and release kittens or friendly cats that could be adoptable, or they promote TNR as an effective solution when science tells us it's not. TNR could be one of these tools in the toolkits for free-roaming cat management if legislation required it to be done effectively. And I've been heavily involved in the Virginia assemblies, the state legislator on different recommendations. We have a stakeholder group that has discussed many of these recommendations and things that could be done to limit the free-roaming cat population. And TNR has not been taken completely off the table there. But one of the things that the stakeholders who are trying to reduce the outdoor cat population are suggesting is that if we are going to legalize TNR truly in Virginia, we only want to make it legal with a certain standard being held. So requiring that these animals are sterilized, that they are vaccinated, that they do get health checks, that they are microchipped, things like that. But it's really difficult to get that legislation passed because TNR advocates don't want anything that they, would consider getting in the way of a TNR program. So in general, even though these seem like two groups that are very opposed to each other, I think it's important to note that TNR advocates and opponents actually agree on a lot. Both of our groups want cats treated humanely. We just disagree on what is and isn't humane. And research can be really confusing. There's a lot of studies that suggest TNR is successful or is effective. And if you don't really know the science, you don't really know the sources and the conflicts of interest at play, it can be really hard to determine which articles are legitimate and which ones aren't. And it's also important that a lot of these pieces that people are reading are just opinion pieces or things put out by shelters that are doing TNR. They're not actually scientific studies. So it's important that you really know how to read science and understand what good science and bad science is. The outdoor life that we can reasonably provide for cats, I would argue, is certainly not humane. That's one of the big arguments between TNR advocates and opponents. Is if you truly believe it's humane to have, these poisonings and vehicle collisions and other things that happen to cats, to domestic animals, and you believe that it's humane to have their lifespan shortened that much, then you could argue that TNR is potentially a humane option. I don't think most veterinarians agree with that. I certainly don't agree with that. And then you have, again, the people who think that no kill means it's humane. And I would certainly argue against that. Again, as a veterinarian that does perform a lot of euthanasia where it's necessary, I think euthanasia is a far better option, a far more humane option than dumping a cat back out in the street. So trap, neuter, adopt, or trap, neuter, euthanize are two other options that people have considered. Again, these are not the only options in the toolkit here, but these are other options that are being considered. So the one reason that I prefer this to TNR would be that I believe it's humane, right? If we trap and neuter animals and adopt them out, that is a humane way to handle that cat and to get it into a good indoor home. If it cannot be adopted, then that cat must be euthanized. And again, euthanasia by definition is a humane process. Abandonment is not. So one way to get the cat out from the outdoor world, whether it be through adoption or euthanasia, at least it would be a humane option. I don't necessarily promote this over other solutions, which I think a lot of people would expect me to, and that's because you have to still look at the results. Typically, this is as ineffective as TNR unless you are adopting out and euthanizing greater than 70% of the population. So you still need to hit those numbers in order to be effective. If you're just taking one or two cats out of the population, you're not having that effect. But again, it is more humane and you're not re-abandoning those cats. So from that perspective, I think it is a positive. It is very labor intensive. It's very costly, habituating cats, fostering them out, getting them used to people, assessing them for adoption. All of that stuff is really expensive and time consuming. So whether you're supporting TNR or TNA, TNE, as this is called, these are methods that should be considered, but they are certainly not effective solutions on their own. Other management strategies, certainly not ones that I necessarily support. Poisoning is one strategy that many countries do use for outdoor cats. It is not humane. Certainly there's a huge risk of secondary poisoning to wildlife or even to humans. But sadly, in many places it is effective. So there are many countries that will put out massive amounts of poison baited in chicken and other meat and things like that in their streets to just poison large numbers of cats all at once. And it does hit those percentages that help the cat population decline. Not condoning that, not saying that's a good option, but that is one option that many places do use. Sanctuaries, these can be humane and effective. They are extremely costly. That's the picture that you see here is basically a large enclosure where you can house multiple cats. So if you have cats that are being socialized in these enclosures as best to the caretaker's ability, they're being fed, they're receiving regular veterinary care, they are kept at an appropriate stocking density. That's a really important one. These situations are very easily turned into hoarding situations, but it can be done humanely. It can be effective. It is extremely costly. And if you don't address that immigration issue of cats being dumped, then it's going to be extremely cost prohibitive as well. And the other option is, of course, do nothing. Immigration continues, people continue to feed and tax strays, and you have no reduction in the population and inhumane treatment of domestic animals. In Virginia specifically, and this does go for many states as well, but Felis catus, the species, are all considered companion animals. And this is really important to me. I think this is a really important protection. A lot of places you have people suggesting that free roaming cats should be considered wildlife or invasive species, and this would not help them or wildlife. So I am really glad that Virginia has committed to calling them companion animals, and I hope we don't ever lose that protection. In Virginia, a cat is considered legally abandoned when a person deserts or gives up that cat without having secured another owner or custodian, or by failing to meet their cat's basic needs. And then all cats over 4 months of age that are owned are required to be up to date on rabies. So those are a good, very basic start. In the last 10 years or so, there have been laws passed saying that feral cats cannot be released to the outdoors once trapped. And this is effectively making TNR illegal. TNR programs are subject to prosecution for abandonment, and feral cats cannot be released by a locality. So I think these are all great pieces of legislation here. I think they're really helpful, but you can get around them really easily. So the feral cats cannot be released by a locality, meaning the shelter can't spay and neuter and then release a bunch of animals into a colony. But they can hand them over to an organization that does that, right? They can adopt them out that way, and then that organization can release all of those cats. So huge loophole. And TNR is very commonly practiced in Virginia, even though there are all these kind of things to put a stop to it. The gaps that are largely in this policy is that there's no running at large prohibition for cats as there is for dogs. It is illegal in Virginia to let your dog free roam. It is not illegal to let your cat free roam. There's no license requirement for cats. There's no sterilization requirement for cats. And my biggest issue is that there's no requirement for public shelters to accept cats. So it can be extremely difficult if you do have a stray cat or a cat that's causing problems in your neighborhood. You can't just trap that cat and bring it to a shelter. Most shelters are not going to accept that cat. So you have no option but to dump it back out in your yard. So TNR often suggested as a way to reduce populations, but there's no proof that it effectively does this. And legislation is a huge problem against that. I put this statement in, you don't have to read the whole thing, but just suggesting that the American Veterinary Medical Associations, this is America's largest organization of veterinary professionals, strongly supports reducing and controlling the numbers of free roaming cats in the US, and specifically suggests adopting state local ordinances that would prohibit the abandonment of cats, require the sterilization, require rabies vaccinations, require microchips, require identification of managed colonies, and then also have encouragement of owners to keep cats indoors, prohibit public feeding. That's a really important one. So people who are really well-intentioned but have no interest in actually reducing the population will often feed intact free-roaming cats, causing a further increase in the population. And the AVMA recommends preventing establishment of managed colonies in wildlife-sensitive areas. So a lot of strong statements from the veterinary community suggesting that these are all other ways that we could help this situation. Solutions. So I think a lot of the solutions are going to be cultural, education, and legislative. Education-wise, I think there needs to be a much bigger push for cat owners, talking about the importance of keeping cats indoors, in catios, on leashes, and in backpacks. I love seeing cats out walking on leashes. I think people need to normalize that much more. I think there needs to be more government support of low-cost spay-neuter options. I think a lot of people, especially in my area in rural Virginia, are not getting their cats spayed and neutered. They're not keeping them inside, largely because of the cost. And culturally, I would like to see people treat cats like dogs. I think if we moved this way, kept cats indoors, really cared for them as pet species, it would be a lot more beneficial to the population. It was once fully acceptable to let your dog free roam, and people stopped doing that, and we stopped having feral packs of dogs that were attacking wildlife and causing problems. And we could do the same thing for cats, but it will certainly take generations. We do want to encourage owners to let their cats outside under controlled conditions, meaning, again, in a catio, on a leash, things like that, and educating people on enrichment needs. I think a lot of people pick cats as pets because they think it's an easy pet that they can ignore, and that's certainly not the situation. Cats often require a lot more stimulation and enrichment than dogs do. And if you're not prepared to do that, don't accept a cat as an easy pet. There's also these kind of little window type catios that you can build yourself or purchase. There's the cat fence-in type fences that you see at zoos where the fence kind of curves over the top of your fence line. And that allows you to have your cat basically in your backyard the way a lot of people do with their dogs. It's obviously not a perfect situation. We get cat attacked animals from catios and from fenced-in yards regularly. But it obviously decreases the amount of wildlife that your cat can kill and the the area to which they can transmit disease. So these are my opinions. So I like to preface it with that. But public shelters need to be legally required to accept both cats and dogs. This kind of no-kill status that so many are vying for, because it does help with donations, means that a lot of these shelters would rather dump cats back outside than actually provide humane euthanasia. If they euthanize the animals and they lose that no-kill status, they will lose donations. So it is advantageous for a lot of shelters to not accept cats or to immediately kick them back out rather than providing care. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. And I think that's a huge problem in our shelter system. Open admission shelters and public shelters that are required to take cats often get a lot of heat for high euthanasia rates. And that's because they are accepting cats that they can't get back out at high enough numbers. I'd like to see shelters end barn cat programs and working cat programs. These are outdoor cat programs. These are free roaming cats. We should not be encouraging people to use them. And certainly they are not as good at, killing rodents and keeping your barn safe as people like to imagine. There are many better ways to do this that don't involve keeping a domestic animal outside, and they are certainly not selective at killing just invasive house mice and rats. Enforcing abandonment laws, very important. So feral cats, we should update to not just be released by a locality, but also not be released by an individual. Prohibit running at large for cats like we do for dogs. Increase public education on proper pet care and the inhumane and ineffective nature of TNR as it's currently practiced. And I think the public needs to know a lot more about the effects of cats on the environment and public health and public safety. So if we do decide that TNR is one tool that people want to use, I think it's especially important that we create really high standards and make sure that people are doing it in a way that's as effective as possible and as humane as possible, because it's certainly not being done that way right now. I put this picture in. This is me just after vet school, my first internship, where I was participating in TNR. I think it's one of those things that's really common for vet students to do because you get to a lot of surgical experience really quickly and you feel like you're doing something good because nobody really tells you you're not. But once you recognize the problem, it's important that when we know better, we do better. And I am a case of this as well. So in conclusion, I hope you walk away realizing that domestics are, of course, an invasive species, that they're a huge threat to wildlife, and that they spread lots of infectious disease. Removing cats from the landscape minimizes biodiversity loss and minimizes public health risks. So we do want these guys out of the landscape. And cats are a human-created companion animal. They deserve humane treatment, and releasing them to colonies with minimal care and no protection from the environment is not an acceptable nor humane solution. So we need to be looking past that and finding other solutions that work to reduce this population. All right, I think that is all I have for you guys now. So if you have any questions, we can go back to those. I will unshare my screen. And feel free to ask any questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, thank you so much for so deftly and thoroughly handling this topic. It's a tough one, and that was masterful. Thank you.
Thank you. I can look
Learned a
through some of the
lot.
questions. Good.
Jen, you can see if now that you're not screen sharing, a couple questions
Yeah.
in the Q&A. I did Google some stuff about like Missouri specifics, but I think we'll get there. So
Mhm.
take it away there.
Looking at the first question that I see here is indirect impacts of cats on wildlife. Are they the same with dogs as well? The decreased foraging, et cetera. I would love to know that. Unfortunately, that's not something that has been studied. Like I said, there was only the 2 studies that I could find looking at the fear-related effects that cats have on wildlife. I assume it would be very similar for dogs, but those studies don't exist, so I can't say for sure. And if it is the same for dogs, we don't have dogs free roaming at the same level that we do as for cats, right? We don't really have significant numbers, at least in Virginia, of free roaming dogs. We do have about 2.1 million free roaming cats in Virginia. So it's just the numbers of it are staggering. You mentioned lethal control in your area is illegal. Can you expand on that?
So Jen, I did a little bit of looking on this.
Mm-hmm.
So in Missouri, there are no laws that protect invasive species. I believe that's true for things like house sparrows and European
Yeah.
starlings, as you brought
So
up earlier. But so the catch in this is that it is so this I'm just going to read the summary. It's not legal to shoot free roaming cats in Missouri because it is considered animal abuse and
yeah,
violates the state's animal cruelty laws. While Missouri law permits the control of certain wildlife that is causing property damage, this exemption does not apply to feral cats, which are not considered wildlife under the Wildlife Code. So
exactly. So that's the same situation that we have in Virginia. It is legal to shoot any domestic animal or kill any domestic animal in Virginia. So if you were to shoot a groundhog in your yard, no problem. You shoot a cat in your yard, you've now created an animal cruelty situation. So very similar, and it's like that across most states. Ultimately, having the public shoot cats is not going to solve the problem either. Nobody's going out to hunt cats at large levels that would actually have a population level impact. So that's kind of one of the reasons that I mentioned that I support cats being treated as companion animals in Virginia. I think it's about the humane treatment of cats, and there's ways to do this humanely. I also don't support everybody shooting nuisance wildlife in Virginia, but there's no law for that. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure, but okay. In the short term, with shelters not accepting feral cats, what do we do with a cat that's causing problems in our yard? Um, Area to area, everything is so different. So in some counties, even within Virginia, some animal controls will assist you if you call them and say, I have a problem cat in my yard. If you can trap it, they'll scan it for a microchip. They'll see if it has an owner. They'll bring it back to that owner and talk to that owner. They won't require anything because they can't. But we have had people annoy their neighbors enough that their cats start staying inside at some point. So things like that can work. But typically these are abandoned cats and your shelter's probably not going to take them. And it's something that you just have to talk about with your neighbors and, try to get education throughout the neighborhood. But unfortunately, there's not really a good short-term solution. If the shelters in your areas are not accepting these cats, you can talk to other shelters. There are shelters in Southwest Virginia that have taken cats from our area up north when our area couldn't. So there are areas that will take them and you can sometimes transport them. There's certainly not enough facilities available. And because of the funding situations, there's not enough shelters willing to euthanize cats that are problematic. That would affect their numbers and then it affects their donations. So that's why I think a lot of this has to be cultural change that unfortunately is going to take generations to really create. This is not a problem that we're solving in the next 5 or 10 years. What measures can adoption centers or humane societies implement to ensure owner compliance in keeping cats indoors and maintaining up-to-date vaccinations? Obviously, you can't ever ensure that. I think there needs to be a lot more education. I would love to see a lot of shelters giving away vouchers for things like your vaccination status and giving out brochures on catios and why it's important. I think a lot of people are kind of given cats or they find cats and they don't really have a good background in what's appropriate for keeping that cat healthy and safe. And I would love to see even veterinarians. I think we're doing 15-minute appointments in small animal. People are going as quick as they can. They're not sitting down and having these important discussions with cat owners on what should be happening to keep your cat safe and to keep the environment safe. So I think a lot more education should be pushed especially in adoption centers and humane societies and things like that. I would love to see them have more content telling people how to take care of cats properly, basically. And I would love to see them being more honest about actual TNR numbers and stats and things like that, because these places know these numbers. But again, a lot of it does come down to donations, and that's understandable. We're a nonprofit, we run off donations as well. I get it. If you lose the donations, then you can't do what you do. So I understand why there's a concern there, but I definitely think it's something that humane societies have an obligation to educate the public about and make sure that the cats they're adopting out are treated appropriately. And then how were the large estimate numbers arrived at for the overall bird deaths by cats? So there are a lot of different studies and a lot of different methods to these studies. So that's why these ranges are so massive. I think I talked about the small mammal ones being 6 to 20 billion animals per year in the US. We know it's massive. So in a lot of areas, they're doing it based on the population of cats. So they will use trail cams, camera traps, things like that to figure out how many free roaming cats are actually in an area. And then they can also use GoPros, things like that on collars, or like how many witnessed events they see for an individual cat. And then they'll multiply that by the number of cats in the area. So sometimes they are looking at actual individual deaths and what's happening. Other times they are looking at one individual cat and making generalizations, which is not great because some cats kill 3 or 4 birds a year, some cats kill hundreds, right? There is huge range. So some studies are definitely better than others with their methods, but the methods do vary greatly across those studies, which is why a lot of people will use those conservative estimates like 2.4 billion, which is still massive, to see that. And then there's also good studies by wildlife centers. The Wildlife Center of Virginia has one of the biggest studies on retrospective studies looking at like 20 years of cat data for cat attack victims. And we know how many animals are coming in to wildlife centers for a variety of reasons, but how many are coming in due to cats alone? So a lot of that information is really important. And those are typically marked as cat attacks when they are direct predation situations. So for example, at our center and at other centers, if they come in for toxoplasmosis, we're not calling that a cat attack, right? So that's not getting added to some of these studies that are using wildlife center data the way that the direct cat attacks are. So again, those numbers, yes, they are estimates. It's not going to be the most accurate number because of the variation in methodology, but it is always a very conservative estimate. And then I don't know anything about the status of feral cats in Missouri. It definitely varies by state, so I don't know if you guys have any information specifically.
That's a great question, Kimberly. I was trying to look it up because I saw your question in the chat. This doesn't answer your question, what I just put in the chat, and I'm sorry. But it's an old article from 1999 from the MDC that talks about this issue, and I just think it's really illustrative of like how long we've been kind of trying to work on this. That article back in 99 says that at the time, 60 million cats are kept as pets in, I'm sorry, in 1990, up from 50 million in 1980. That's, I believe, a nationwide number. But the estimate at that point is that there were more than 100 million cats, and this is 25 plus years ago. And it's not going to be the same for every state, but nationally, you're talking a couple hundred million, right, John?
For
Um,
sure. Yeah. I mean, the 2 million in Virginia is just purely outdoor cats. That doesn't include indoor, outdoor owned cats and things
yeah.
like that. This is outdoor free roaming cats. So yeah, there's millions per state, certainly. And well over
So
that.
that number doesn't include indoor, outdoor. That's
Yeah,
that's
that is
just a like
purely free
research.
roaming.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
ferals and strays that are outside, or 100% outdoor cats like barn cats and things like that.
MU Vet School did a study in Columbia a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, and they found just in Columbia alone there was 37,000 feral cats.
Yeah. So those numbers are also greatly underestimated in most cases. Are there any other questions that we missed?
Looking around.
And I see a couple comments in the chat. I want to say, Sammy, good luck. Yeah, all you can do is your best. That's an awesome effort.
There's
Yeah, I'm hopeful this talk
any
maybe inspired people a little bit to, even just to make a scene yourself, walk your cat if you have a cat that you can get on a leash, that you can get harness trained, and you live in a neighborhood where people see you. I live in the woods, so I can't really do much, but if you're in like a main street area, walk your cat, make it impressive. Make sure you're talking to your friends, your neighbors, about the things that you're seeing and about the stats that you know and how dangerous it is to have their cats outside. And, you can always come from the concerned neighbor standpoint of, I saw your cat outside, it almost got hit, I was so scared, do what you can to keep your cat inside. So even though feral cats are a massive problem, and that's where a lot of the argument tends to stray towards, about half of the free roaming cats that are actually killing wildlife are these indoor, outdoor owned cats or barn cats or working cats. So it's important to talk to those owned cat owners, the owners of those cats, and make sure that they understand the issue as well.
Jen, have you seen any attitude shifts, even just like anecdotally, when people find out that they're native? Because I think a lot of times people are like, it's an animal, there's animals outside, like it, like this is what it naturally does, right? And then you're like, it's totally not native to here, though. Does that have an impact that you have observed?
I mean, we get that comment a lot. So we, at our wildlife center, we have a huge social media following, and a lot of the comments that we receive are, circle of life, or this is nature, that kind of thing. So we do like to remind people that certainly circle of life applies to native ecosystems and native food webs. And these animals are not part of that. And even if they were part of it, because people will comment, bobcats are also cats that can kill wildlife. Of course they are. We have nowhere near the number of bobcats in the US as we do the number of outdoor domestic cats. So these are really apex predators that are in artificially, ridiculously high numbers. So having them, from the animal's perspective, getting killed by a domestic cat or a bobcat, probably not a huge difference for the individual animal. But when you're talking about this population of cats that are non-native predators, it is a massive population that should not be part of that ecosystem, that should not be part of that food web. So this is not the circle of life. This is a human-owned animal or human, same as if your dog attacked something. So like we always talk about with wildlife, if you see a native predator-prey interaction happening, if you see a hawk grab a bunny, you don't want to chase that hawk away. That's the native food web. That is the meal that hawk gets. If you take that bunny away, that hawk now has to go kill something else. Now two animals have likely died. for that animal to get a meal, and it's really hard for that hawk to get a meal, right? We want those hawks to have their meals. If your cat or dog comes out and gets a bunny, you take that bunny away and you bring it to a rehabilitator, because that's a very different situation. That's not the circle of life. That's not this natural cycle. That is a human-owned animal. And even if it's not an owned animal, in the case of like a feral cat, it is a human-caused animal that is in the environment that is killing these things, not a native predator. But yeah, we get the argument a lot that it's a circle of life thing, or this is just nature. And being natural and being a native part of the ecosystem are different things. Like, yes, the cat naturally has that instinct. Humans have a natural instinct to kill people too. They don't do it, or it's illegal if they do, they go to jail, things like that. Like, there's a lot of these kind of arguments you can make. If your 2-year-old wanted to go out and kill people, would you let it roam because that was what was, best for your 2-year-old? No, like it's the same kind of argument to me that if this is a domestic species, humans have authority over it, and we should be protecting them and protecting the actions they take. The cats and baby
Okay, yeah.
strollers comments is also a
Yeah.
good one. Backpacks and strollers. If you can't walk your cat on a leash, just walk it another way. Contained.
I like that picture of the backpack with the cat looking out of the little window in the backpack.
That's the Taylor Swift picture. Everybody is used to seeing
Is
her
it?
backpack, I think. Yeah. But it's a great, I've seen those backpacks that other people carry too, and they work really well, and it lets your cat get out and see the world and shows people that your cat can have enrichment in the outside world without being free roaming.
Walk with pride. They call it the cat walk, not the slouch walk.
Okay, y'all, if nobody else has any more questions, this is our
Not
one
it.
time in 2 years that we
Yeah.
were able to get a veterinarian and cat expert. So
Thanks for listening.
cool.
Thanks for being there.
Jen, thanks so much. And thanks everybody who joined us tonight.
Thank
This will
you.
be available on YouTube, so please feel free to share. This will be a great one to share with people.
See you around,
Okay.
everybody.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody.